Big hello to everybody out there in internet land and welcome to the Grow Conversations podcast. This is episode 2, I believe. And we are here today, your window into the world of medical cannabis with a sort of UK tint. Today we have Barbara Mainville on the show. She is a physician and a prescriber working out of Ontario, Canada. Am I getting that right, Barbara?
Yep.
Great. Welcome to the show, Barbara. Lovely to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. So we should probably give a little bit of a background to our relationship. So Barbara does a little bit of consulting as well for Grow Pharma and Grow Biotech, who I work for as patient access specialist. But she also works in the prescribing sector with Medi-Green. That's correct, isn't it?
Medi-Green and Apollo.
Okay, great.
Apollo Applied Research.
Okay, we'll delve into those two organizations a little bit in just a moment. The first thing I really want to talk to you about, Barbara, is so how did you sort of start your journey into cannabis? Where did that start for you? Was that something you had a personal interest in, or was this just something that you stumbled across?
It was completely by accident, completely. I had worked 30 years in the same emergency department in the town that I actually grew up in, and thought I would finish my career there. But then they implemented some new policies that I just could not live with. And it got to the point where I decided it was time for me to leave. And I decided that if I was going to leave the ER, I didn't want at that point to go to another ER. And I decided I wanted to do something completely different, but I had no idea what. And so I opened up the classified ads in the Medical Post, and right at the top was this ad saying opening soon in Ottawa, the Cannabinoid Medical Clinic. And it's like, well, that sounds interesting. I had no clue how interesting it would be. When I first got involved with it, I knew absolutely nothing. What got my attention initially, after that first step, was the fact that cannabis doesn't kill people, and I'd never actually processed that. When I look back, my career in the ER, the worst thing I ever saw was maybe a teenager partying with his buzz would have too much of the wrong stuff, go on a bad trip, and end up in the ER. We'd give him something to calm him down, let him sleep it off, and a few hours later he would walk out. I also was a coroner for the province of Ontario for 30 years. And the worst thing I ever saw as a coroner had to do with the illegal nature of cannabis and involved things like AK-47s and had nothing to do with cannabis toxicity. But I'd never actually consciously processed that. And it's like, wait a minute, there's something out there we can use to treat pain and anxiety and insomnia that doesn't kill people. Why aren't we using this more? And
sorry, go ahead.
As I got more involved with it and started to learn more about it, I came across the gem of information that the main purpose of our endocannabinoid system is to maintain homeostasis. It's all about keeping our systems in balance and running smoothly. It's basically all about keeping us normal and healthy. And really, the endocannabinoid system is the key to our health and well-being. And I have been convinced for a good while now. I've been working with cannabis medicine for about 4.5 years now. And I've been convinced for a good while that this is the future of medicine, learning to work with the endocannabinoid system and learning to work with the plant.
Brilliant. I mean, I totally agree. The fact that it doesn't kill is, I mean, for me, it was a huge factor as a patient treating pain. I was offered obviously serious opiates from doctors and serious other drugs as well. I've had surgery, so I've been on fentanyl. I've been on all the strong opiates and strong painkillers you can think of, and it's amazing to me that we have this one particular tool in our kit where the side effects are so minimal in comparison to the others, and yet we're not really utilizing it fully. And that, obviously there's a massive gap there, and it sounds like you've started bridging that gap in Canada and the work that you're doing. And I think we're catching up now. We're playing a big game of catch up here in the UK to not only Canada, but a few other countries as well. And let's delve into that a little bit more as well, just a bit further on how things differ in in Canada in terms of prescription access and things like that. But I'm also really interested to hear about sort of the different companies that you do work with in that space. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about Medi-Green, and what was the name of the other one you did mention?
Apollo Applied Research.
Sure. So
when I first started, I was working with the Cannabinoid Medical Clinic, which has since changed its name to Cannabo. And I've just recently left there and moved over to Apollo Applied Research, which, as the name suggests, is very research oriented. And there's a lot of research that I am interested in doing. That is mainly prescribing licensed producer product. In Canada, we have a licensed producer system. I haven't looked lately. Last time I looked, there was over 300 with movement in the market. I know a few of those have gone into receivership, and I don't know how many more have been added, but they're certainly not all in production, but we still have a lot of companies in production. Mm-hmm. The product is all federally regulated and quality controlled. I believe it now is required by law to be third-party tested. So we have very good quality product to work with. Each of the licensed producers has their own individual product lines. It's not, what kind of orange juice do I buy today? It's the product lines are very different. So a lot of the process is in understanding what it is you're actually looking for and then locating it on the market. So the licensed producers are quite responsive. When I first started, there was maybe 10 licenses in the country. Certainly Canopy was the first one to start talking about terpenes. And I didn't know anything about these, but got curious and started learning about them, and began to appreciate how useful working with the terpenes can be. And certainly more and more and more of the licensed producers are giving some form of terpene information. Sometimes it's very detailed, sometimes it's just in the form of ratios, but it can really help people obtain the right product. One of the things about our system is it's actually the patient that places the order. My medical document sets limits, but it does not specify specific products or specific strains. So it's with my authorization, essentially, the patient can then go on to the website of the licensed producer and select the product that they want. So the more they can understand about what they're looking at, the more they'll be able to make rational choices. And a lot of them will, with time and experience, start custom blending. So if they get something that initially looks like it's probably what they want, but they try it and it's like, yeah, no, not what I'm looking for. Instead of wasting it, they can then combine it with a second product that has sort of complementary terpenes, maybe CBD to tone down THC, that sort of thing. So patient education is actually a very, very important part of the whole process. The Medi-Green, I actually am mainly involved with their MyGrow program, which, as the name suggests, is about people who want to grow their own. In Canada, we've actually had medical cannabis legal since 2001. But initially that system allowed people to either grow their own, or they could send into Health Canada once a month for their monthly allotment of the single strain of government approved medical cannabis, which was a THC strain. I think it ran about 10 or 12%. I'm not sure exactly, but I think it was in that ballpark. And I don't know what the terpenes were at all. And so if that one specific strain happened to work for you, that was great. If it didn't, then your only option was really to grow your own if you wanted to do it legally.
Sure. And things have developed quite a lot since then in terms of the different products available. And I suppose it's developed as well with the, how patients are growing their own. Is that something that you've seen increase in terms of the amount of patients that are doing that, or do you think that that's something that do you find that the more patients are moving towards sort of the medicines that you're prescribing, or do you feel that there's sort of a clear group of patients that do want to do this for themselves? I think the conversation around growing in the UK is very minimal. We don't, obviously nothing is legal on that score, and everything's, it's prescription or nothing basically in terms of legality. And I think there is a big misconception perhaps in different areas, perhaps, that allowing patients to grow their own, even if you just decriminalize that, that perhaps might cut into the profits of the producers. But we see in Canada that we have, patients are legally able to grow their own, and it seems like the producers of medicines are still, happily making money as well. So is there sort of essentially just a divide where there's two different groups of patients here, those that want to be more self-sustaining and those that are more interested in sort of involving the doctor? Is that how that works?
There's quite a spectrum of it all. And most people who've been using cannabis for any length of time are interested in growing, but they aren't necessarily in a position to. So say somebody who's renting in an apartment or a house, or that's those sort of issues. With LED lights, it doesn't change the electric bill too horribly anymore, but it more often comes down to a question of space. People are allowed to choose a designated grower. So if they can contact somebody who can grow for them, a lot of people opt for that. One of the things we're blessed with in Canada is lots and lots of space, though. So there certainly are a lot of people who can grow their own. And some people do get into it quite big time. And the way the legislation is written, if somebody's authorized for 1 gram a day, that allows them to grow 2 plants outdoors, which in our climate means 1 harvest a year, or they can grow 5 plants indoors, which means anywhere from 2 to 4 harvests a year. And it's like, I think the government really doesn't want people to grow outside. But it's very, very non-specific. And the people that do grow their own, sometimes we are now, under the recreational legislation, allowed to grow up to 4 plants per household. And so certainly that's a good starting place. A lot of people will still have relatively small grows. Some of them will just have those 4 plants and then buy things like the oils from the licensed producers. And if they want to inhale some, they'll use those 4 plants for those purposes. Some people will grow more than the 4 plants, but still keep their own plants mainly for inhaling, and they'll still buy the oils. They'll still stay with a licensed producer, especially for the oils. Now that we have the oil cartridge vaporizers, those are pretty hard for people to produce on their own. They sometimes will try new products from the licensed producers. So there certainly are reasons why people will carry on with a licensed producer. Also, even though they call it weed, cannabis is not the easiest plant to grow. There's certainly a lot to know about it. There's quite a learning curve. And so even if somebody is authorized for, say, 5 grams a day to grow 5 grams a day on their own, that doesn't necessarily mean by any stretch that they're going to actually get 5 grams a day, partly because of that imprecision of the gram to plant conversion. And also, what is a plant? A plant can be 2 feet tall, it can be 12 feet tall, and 8 feet across. So very, very imprecise legislation, but at least we have it, and I'm very grateful for that. And certainly so are my patients. But also crop failures, things like spider mites. If somebody's growing outdoors, a bad hailstorm or a tornado, whatever, can certainly be big factors. I do have other patients who are growing between 50 and 90 grams a day, wow. Which is a lot of plants. And they are largely processing it. So they're using a lot of it raw. And one of my fascinations in the world of cannabis, the whole field is fascinating, but raw cannabis is especially so. Raw cannabis does not make people high.
Yeah.
And
before we move on, for those of us who are watching who might not know exactly why that is, this is the process of decarboxylation. You have to heat the cannabinoids, specifically THC in this case, in the plant in order to activate it, and then it gives that psychoactive effect. But as you're saying, if you don't heat it, if you're not vaporizing or smoking that raw plant, there's no psychoactive effect there. So, and this is something that I, in context in the UK, we're talking about, what if my prescribed medicine is lying around and my toddler picks it up and eats it? And I'm not suggesting that that's particularly safe, but it certainly isn't going to send them into another dimension in terms of psychoactive effect and things like that. So it's good to be aware of. It's good knowledge to have. And sorry, continue what you were saying.
Yeah, we don't understand the details of how raw cannabis benefits people. We know that THC is in its non-intoxicating form, THCA. All the other cannabinoids are in their acid forms. They're not generally intoxicating when they are decarboxylated, so it's less of an issue, but we don't have a good understanding of what they're contributing. Also in the raw plant, you're still getting the terpenes, and even though they haven't been activated, they still seem to have an effect. I've had people tell me that if they juice their heavy indica that they smoke before bed and they drink that during the day, it makes them too sleepy. But if they switch to juicing a nice energizing sativa strain, then they have a very good day. So the terpenes are there. They're still doing something. The flavonoids are fascinating. We're only starting to scratch the surface with the flavonoids. Harvard came out with a study about a year ago showing that one of them is actually looking quite interesting. Looking quite interesting in the treatment of cancer of the pancreas. So that's neat. University of Guelph here in Ontario identified two other ones that are actually 30 times more potent than aspirin as anti-inflammatory analgesics. So interesting stuff there. How much are they contributing? And the other thing we know is that these things have been together for a very, very long time. And they found some fossilized cannabis pollen in Tibet that they dated back 28 million years. And we know that all the cannabinoids are basically siblings. They come from the same parent molecule, the CBGA. And so we're basically talking about siblings who have had to live together for 28 million years.
Yeah. Brutal. As many people who are currently lockdowning will know, it's not easy.
And so if you can try and imagine that, regardless of the differences early on, at some point you'll accept your fate. And it's like, okay, we got to make this work. We're stuck here together. And you would learn how to get along and play well together. Over enough time, your relationship would become quite complex and ultimately quite interdependent. And that very much describes what we know so far about the relationship of CBD and THC. That's certainly the relationship we know most about. But I think it's quite fair to assume that that concept applies to everything in the plant. And so last time I looked on Seed Finder, they were listing over 14,000 different cultivars. And all with different combinations of these different things. There's about 150 different phytocannabinoids. CBD and THC are certainly the ones we know most about, but there's about 150 total. About over 200 terpenes and about 20 flavonoids. And so all these different combinations and permutations give different effects. But everything is indicating that they work best when they're together.
And what you're hinting at there is what's more commonly known as the entourage effect, which I always sort of perhaps cynically describe as a term for something that we don't really understand yet. But you describe it so well, and how that sort of developed in terms of the evolution of the plant. I think it's fantastic. And I think we're at a very early stage in the UK. Even the medicines here are particularly focused on THC and CBD and very little else. I imagine that's probably the case in Canada. I don't know whether you are particularly prescribing specific cannabinoids outside of those two, or if there's anything. Obviously, they're a full plant, a full spectrum, a full profile. whatever you want to call it, products, and there are isolate products, and we have those here in the UK as well, which is great. But actually understanding the mechanisms of what's happening in that wider spectrum or wider profile, oils or even flowers, is still in its infancy in terms of our scientific understanding and the biomechanisms there. So what I wonder is, are you at the point now where you've started to see prescriptions for perhaps some of the more rare cannabinoids, or just products that are focusing on those more?
Not prescriptions for them per se. Most of the licensed producers haven't expanded in that direction yet. There's really only one of them that is starting to look at the minor cannabinoids, and they give actually the profiles of the products, including things like THCV, CBG, CBC, I think they talk about. Maybe CBN, I haven't looked in a little while. I do have a few patients who are looking in that direction. THCA is a little more common, which is the form that it's founded in the raw plant. I don't generally start people on THCA oil at this time of year because it's not heat stable, and the shipping can be problematic. So I'll usually, if I'm going to try THCA for somebody, I'll start it when the weather's cooler, and then make sure they stock up before the weather gets hot. But the other cannabinoids, CBG is sort of almost the cannabis version of the stem cell. It's the parent molecule. And so very interesting potential there. I'm not an expert on CBG, but certainly I do have some patients that have been experimenting with it, and it's not psychoactive. And so that's quite intriguing as well. And I have been coming across some research that's looking at CBG, THCA, CBG, CBGA, CBDA. But yeah, the actual lab research in that direction is still pretty limited.
Sure. And I think that's the case internationally on that front. That's sort of where we are, I feel, in terms of the international scientific community around cannabis and cannabinoid research seems to be at this place where we have a fairly good understanding of THC, CBD, and maybe a handful of others in terms of their effects as an isolate, but how that works in the human body, perhaps we haven't gone past in vitro into in vivo quite yet in those particular cannabinoids. So I think the big takeaway for me personally is, though you guys have been doing this since 2001, and you're obviously quite a way ahead of us in terms of different legal options for patients, but also you talk about hundreds of producers. We've got a handful of those in the UK just starting. But it does seem like there is the sort of general point internationally where we're all at the same place with our understanding. So I guess what I'm hoping is that it won't take us 19 years to catch up with you since 2001. So I'm hoping we can jump a few hurdles, and perhaps you guys in Canada can help us, and we can get ourselves to a much more positive place. Now, I didn't want to, I wasn't expecting to get too much into Grow Your Own. Obviously, it's not something that's available to patients here, and I certainly don't want to go on about it and make those who are watching particularly jealous of what patients can do over in Canada. But I am particularly interested in the role that you play in terms of growing, and how you help patients in that as a physician.
My main role is to authorize them to apply to Health Canada. I write a medical document that they then submit with their application to Health Canada. So that they can get their license from Health Canada to grow their own. But certainly a lot of the people that start getting into growing their own, they do it with the idea that they want to have their own product that they can smoke. And inhaling cannabis, whether you're smoking it or vaping it, or a dried herb vaporizer, or an oil cartridge vaporizer, they start working very quickly, but they tend to wear off pretty quickly as well. And so that gives a very uneven effect over the course of the day. You got relief, your symptoms come back. You got relief, your symptoms come back. And so the whole day is kind of up and down. And so what I do try and do with them is look at strategies to, first of all, even out their day. And when they're first getting started, that usually is by using oils from a licensed producer. When they're first getting started, they're not going to get an awful lot of product off their plants likely. And so if they use oils from the licensed producer and then supplement with their inhaled product, they'll probably need to inhale less and have a more even day. As they get better at growing, then we can look at them using it raw. And so I'm often the very first person to mention this concept to them. Have they heard anything about using it raw? And when you grow the cannabis plant, initially you have these lovely green leaves, and as the plant matures and starts to flower, it starts putting all its energy into its flowers, and the leaves start turning brown and dying. And I've actually talked to people that when that starts, they'll strip all the leaves off and just compost the leaves. And it's like, well, instead of doing that, you can throw the leaves into a blender with a bit of water, liquefy them, and then freeze them and make ice cubes with them. And then when you need a bit of help during the day, you're having a rough day, you can take some of those ice cubes out, throw them into a smoothie, and get some benefit from the raw cannabis. Even just plucking the lower leaves off a few at a time. People will chop them up and throw them into salads, or they'll throw them into a smoothie. That's a way of getting some benefit from the plant, a part of the plant that they'd be wasting anyway. And then that sort of leads them in quite nicely to the idea of maybe eventually actually juicing the flowers and using the raw cannabis. It's very, very easy to make somebody comfortable at the end of the day. And it's very, very easy to help somebody get a good night's sleep with cannabis. Not hard, but to help their symptoms and actually improve their functionality during the day, that's where things get more complicated. And we do have some tools in our toolbox. CBD is certainly one of them. The THCA oils in the cooler weather primarily is another one, but raw cannabis is the other. And so it's a nice option to have. There's a lot of older construction workers who are still on the job because they're juicing raw cannabis, and it's keeping them away from the opioids.
That's brilliant to hear. And I think that's for me is such an important part of this is providing that alternative that perhaps enables you to go to work and still be functional. And I mean, I was talking to a patient the other day who's a woman in her, I think she's in her 50s. I don't want to get this wrong in case she's watching, but she was talking about she's great. She's got this prescription now, and she can hoover, and she can do the housework, and she can go and take the dog for a walk, and all these other things that she couldn't do beforehand. I think she had fibromyalgia. But that to me is really beautiful to see. And I think one of the most important sort of takeaways from any conversation about this is that this is all about helping people improve and live their lives. Essentially, this isn't about psychoactive use. This isn't about just finding some sort of relief so much as it is about enabling people to live normal lives. And I think that for patients is so important. It's always trying to reach back and crawl back to some sort of normality. And I think that it's brilliant how cannabis can do that. I think the minimal side effects in terms of psychoactive, even when you're using THC comparative to opiates, I think people find, just talking to patients, I think it seems to be a lot more conducive to an active, to a social lifestyle, to work, and to having a cognitive ability as well, comparative to perhaps being zonked out on opiates, for one of a better term. That's really interesting, and it's lovely to hear about the sort of work that you do there. What's fascinating to me is that you've got this sort of legality for all these different things that patients might do, but there's still very much sort of a confirmation or a sign-off that has to happen from the doctor. So you're still very much involved as a physician, despite the fact that the patients are perhaps taking a lot of the care into their own hands and hopefully educating themselves as well while they're doing so. But it sounds like a lot of that sort of comes from yourself. When you talk about you're the sort of first person to suggest they might use oils alongside the flower and things like that, it feels like there is a wealth of knowledge that patients won't necessarily have. And even though they might not want to go down the pharmaceutical route, it's still very much worth being in touch with a doctor and getting that doctor's input. So I think that for me is very important as well. I'm all for patients talking to doctors about their healthcare and their doctors knowing what's up and what they're doing. And we have a situation in the UK where years of stigma and misunderstanding has meant that a lot of the time doctors aren't able to talk to patients about cannabis either because they choose not to, or they have their own personal beliefs about cannabis that might not be too positive, or or just because they're not aware that there are now options, and this is a something that they can, as doctors, legally discuss and potentially even prescribe. So, no, fascinating to hear that. Which sort of brings me on to my next sort of point, which is going to be perhaps about how we fit cannabis into our medical systems. And it feels like in Canada, you've not done what we're trying to do, which is trying to fit cannabis into our medical system, which is obviously very much focused around RCTs, randomized controlled trials. It's focused around sort of single or even just one or two API in a medicine. Obviously, cannabis is more complex than that. What's sort of your opinion about how we fit cannabis into our healthcare system? Should we be trying to replicate how other medicines work, or should we be looking at this slightly different?
It certainly requires a mind shift. We are used to thinking of medications as being single entities. And so this new medication comes onto the market, you do studies, you randomize, unblind it, and you see whether it works in the majority of people, statistically significant majority of people. And it's generally focused on determining, is this safe, is it effective? With cannabis, there's a tendency in the profession to look at it as if it's just one thing, but it's not. It's thousands, like over 14,000 cultivars. And so they tend to look at the evidence that's out there and just interpret it as though medical cannabis is one thing. And that can be very, very misleading. And a lot of the research that's out there doesn't even say what product was used. A lot of it's retrospective, looking at street cannabis, which could be just about anything and could be contaminated or adulterated with just about anything as well. And the example I like to use is with people who are bipolar. So people who are bipolar, manic depressive, they are predisposed to manic psychosis, psychosis being a loss of touch with reality. Well, street cannabis, the whole purpose of street cannabis is that dissociative effect. People use street cannabis for the express purpose of temporarily losing touch with reality. So it's not really a surprise that somebody who has an existing predisposition to that, if they use too much street cannabis, they're more likely to become psychotic. On the other hand, when they looked at people who are bipolar using CBD, the CBD has neuroprotective effects. It stabilizes the nerve tissue. That's how it stops that's how it controls the seizures in the children that are using, is it's stabilizing the nerve tissue. And actually, if you look at the conventional treatments for bipolar, a lot of the medication that they're using now is actually seizure medication, things like Tegretol and valproic acid. And so through that same type of mechanism, the CBD helps to stabilize their moods, and the bipolar people do better. Well, when they're looking at the existing evidence, they say, well, there's this study that shows they got worse, and there's this other study that showed they got better. The two studies nullify each other. We can't draw any conclusions without ever acknowledging that the products these people were using were very, very different. Talking about medical cannabis is like talking about pills. And to say, yeah, we did a study using pills and we got these great results. And it's like, wow, we did a study using pills and we didn't get the same results at all. So it's like, what are we going to do? Throw out pills? No. My approach would be to ask what kind of pills were used. And it's not about proving that cannabis is safe. We know cannabis is safe. It's been cultivated as a crop for over 6,000 years. There's never been a documented case of death by toxicity, and there's no theoretical reason why there would be. So we're talking about a product that has a 6,000-year safety record. We don't have to prove further that it's safe. What we do need to do is learn how to use it and learn how to use the right product at the right time. And so that's what I'm working on.
I think that's a really interesting point that you sort of you hit on there, is that the safety profile is so well known and well understood. And I remember as an advocate being very frustrated by this fact that the doctors were like, we just don't know it works. We don't know it works. Well, that's okay. We might not know that it works. And, you know, depending on what you're treating, depending on the patient group, I mean, there's a different level of knowledge in terms of efficacy there for sure. And there's a ways to go in terms of our research there. I'm not under any illusions that there is a lot more work to be done. But there is a huge amount of evidence in terms of its safety. We know it's safe. And for me personally, it felt like a travesty that we couldn't access something that wouldn't harm us, even if we didn't know it would work. And that, I suppose that speaks to perhaps ways in which the medical systems here in the UK aren't going to work particularly well with cannabis. And it's going to be really interesting. It's something that I want to touch on throughout this podcast with our different guests and really talk about how this is going to work. Is it going to fit? How is that looking? Are we making it fit? Because I think it's an open question there. I honestly don't know the answer. It's fascinating to hear your opinion. I certainly don't think that it's black or white, and we're going to say, well, it's not going to fit at all, or we're saying it definitely will fit. I think there's going to be certain products and certain sort of methodologies, perhaps, that will work through these systems, and others that definitely won't. And fitting. Squeezing, for want of a better word, all the different types of cultivars that you talk about into the NHS is probably never going to happen. I'm apologetic to all the patients that are potentially hopeful that it will. I think that we probably will see flower products on the NHS at some point. Touch wood, I hope. But I don't think we'll see the breadth that you might be able to access perhaps in Canada or in the USA, where they have the dispensary system. And I guess that's another really interesting point, is that I think a lot of the patients, perhaps in the UK, they look to probably more the USA than Canada, no offense, but it's where all the media comes from. It's where all the stories about cannabis seem to come from. And we do consume a lot of American media here in the UK. And I think they're very aware of the dispensary system and how that works and how liberal it is. And they see our own, and without looking at the finer details of educating doctors and research that's going on, they see patients in the USA being able to have access to a wide range of different products, and they see in the UK that's not available, or at least is only starting to become available now. And I suppose Canada sits somewhere in between. It's not quite the dispensary system, is it? Because you've got prescriptions rather than doctor's notes, and you've got the oversight of physicians like yourself. And I suppose the big difference being that in Canada it's federally legal, and in the US this is very much sort of happening in a sort of grey area. I'm really interested to sort of hear your thoughts about the American system, perhaps there, the US.
Very fragmented, very, very fragmented. And it's not federally regulated. The CBD in the US with the Farm Bill in December 2018 made CBD legal across the country in the US. But it's not available for research purposes. To get your hands on CBD for research purposes in the United States, from everything I've read, is next to impossible. And it's also, it's not quality controlled. So you can fill a vape oil cartridge with corn oil and sell it at the gas station and call it CBD. I think we have the better system, biased, I admit, but we are in a position where we can do quality research. Our population is small, though. We have fewer people in our country than they have in the single state of California. So there certainly are some limitations just based on our size, but it's until we got the licensed producer system, which was 2014, we really, all we had to work with was the dried product. And so there certainly still were a lot of limitations, but I think going forward, we have absolute advantages. In the United States, my understanding is the physician will write a prescription for medical cannabis, and the person will go to the dispensary and get some specific product. But in Canada, the medical cannabis is actually all online. People either have to order online or phone their order in, and the product is shipped to them. With legalization of recreational cannabis, there are stores now that are just starting to reopen, and A lot of them are offering curbside pickup, but the recreational stores, when recreational cannabis was legalized, there was kind of a lull in referrals. And my interpretation of that was that people were saying, well, why go through the trouble of getting it medically when I could just walk in and buy it, next week. And with no concept, no understanding of how many choices they would have. And one of the things about our legislation is that the staff at these recreational stores are specifically prohibited by law from giving any sort of medical advice. So if somebody walks in and says, I'm having a terrible time sleeping, do you have something here that can help me sleep? They are not allowed to give advice. I think some of them have iPads and they can, go over to the iPad and do their own research. But the number of choices tends to be quite overwhelming. And so we quite quickly saw our referrals pick up again as people started to realize, oh, this isn't as simple as I thought it might be.
That's really interesting. Fascinating to hear that perhaps a recreational market might cater for cannabis aficionados, again, for want of a better term, but that there's probably a much larger portion of patients who don't necessarily want to be doing quite that level of due diligence with regards to their own medication and would much rather get that guidance from a doctor. Would you say that's the case?
A lot of people want the guidance.
Really interesting. Yeah, and I think that's probably, it is exactly what we see here in the UK, that there's perhaps a small portion of people who are very active in advocacy, who are very knowledgeable about cannabis, probably because there's been an absence of sort of dissemination of that knowledge from any healthcare professional or authority here in the UK. And so they've gone and done this research themselves and have a good understanding. But that research often, and you talk to the patients, they'll say, well, I've been researching it for years. Well, okay, well, it must have been complicated then. If it was something you could research in a couple of days, then you wouldn't have done it for another 2 or 3 years. So there's certainly a lot to learn for patients. Even if you're talking to a doctor, I think there's a lot that you should learn and should understand and should undertake that. But I think doing that alongside a prescriber or a physician like yourself with some expertise is going to make that journey a whole lot easier and simpler, and probably save patients a whole lot of time and hassle as well, experimenting and like you said, doing their own research. And obviously, you go online to do that research nowadays, and there's a lot of information out there, and some of it's good and some of it's not. I think actually probably the majority of it perhaps isn't so great. And it's important for me that we have sort of authorities. I know that there's the Centre for Medical Cannabis opening here, and there's the Association for Cannabinoid Industry and other authorities being set up that are looking like they're going to do that sort of role. But for me personally, I think it's important that doctors are educated about this, and doctors do those years perhaps of research and understanding that is needed so that they can help their patients. That for me is the bottom line there. So I'm just looking through the few list of things I wanted to touch on, and recreational was one of those, and you've touched on that so brilliantly there and made that comparison. I suppose one of the things I wanted to ask you about that was, and you've sort of touched on it already, but do you see recreational access as a hindrance in any way to patients or to medical access?
No.
Not at all. Okay, well that's an easy answer, and I think it's a good answer. I think that we do often have this separation of the two, and I think the separation is important, but perhaps we should be less judgmental of the recreational side from the medical perspective, and understand that perhaps it's not going to get in the way of the progress or the uptake of patients. I think that's something that perhaps we fear in the industry, that if there was a recreational law change here, that the medical side would perhaps not kick off the way we're hoping it will. But I don't think that's the case. From what I've seen in the US and from what you say in Canada, I think patients do want to do this with doctors. They do want to have that sort of regulation of a pharmaceutical grade medicine. I know we're talking about the difference between Canada and the US, and I'd say that's a really important factor there as well. You did mention that anyone could put anything in corn oil and sell it as a vape cartridge, and that's absolutely what we want to avoid. But at the same time, you've got patients in Canada who are growing their own medicine and happily doing so, and I presume happily consuming that and getting on. So it's fascinating. And then obviously patients as well who are doing a bit of both, which I think that to me is really interesting, because we've got very kind of a split divide in the UK of patients who want to grow and patients who want a prescription. But it's interesting that there are also patients who are allowed to grow who still want to go to the prescription side of things to get that extra product that might make their lives that little bit easier. Talk to a doctor and maybe get some advice on cultivars and terpenes and what they should be looking for in terms of what they're growing, perhaps. So I think there's a perhaps the big takeaway here is that we shouldn't be too strict when we start looking at things in the UK. And I don't want to start making suggestions or advocating for any sort of specific law change, but I think there's a lot to be said for keeping an open mind into how these things work. And it's very rarely black and white that we might presume. I think perhaps it's that it's a very polarizing issue that has in Canada become more normal and more accepted. And in the UK, because of that polarization, we have these very black or white, very divided opinions. So I'm hopeful that will move forward and we'll end up in not in a gray area. I want it to be all very clear and above board. But I also do hope that we are understanding of the different ways that this plant can be used and the different ways that people can benefit from it, whether that is, like you talked about, juicing in a more of a dietary sort of holistic realm, as well as perhaps direct treatment of symptoms in prescribed side, and then all the way to recreation and just use for your own enjoyment on the other side as well, which personally I have no issue with. So hopefully my bosses aren't going to tell me off for including that in one of the first episodes of this podcast, but I stand by that. So we'll leave that in. Hopefully it'll make the cut. We'll see. So I think we've come to the end of our time. It's been so lovely to talk to you, Barbara. I don't know if you have any final insights or anything you'd like to say to UK patients, to the UK cannabis industry, or anything that any final message for us over here, if you were going to give us one pointer for how we move forward with cannabis and sort of medical side of that in the UK. Putting you on the spot a bit here.
One thing, let's see. My goodness, there's so many things to say.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you've got so many different interesting insights there. I wonder if you can perhaps one thing for doctors and one thing for patients.
Yeah, the certainly for physicians, the whole concept that cannabis can be used to improve functionality, not on most people's radar. Actually, certainly not on most physicians' radar, and probably also not on most patients' radar. A lot of the people I talk to that have been self-medicating, they will use cannabis in the evening. And the idea that there's a way they can use cannabis during the day to help the day go better is not something they were aware of. So the concept of cannabis to improve functionality, and also just the whole concept that cannabis is not one product, it is thousands of products. And you can't generalize any more than you can generalize about pills. But we are talking about a product with a 6,000-year safety record, and that's working with the system of our body, basically responsible for our health and well-being. And we're certainly, as a profession in Canada, I think at kind of a crossroads with this. I think this is something our profession should be embracing. But Big Pharma is certainly alive and well, and they are exerting their pressure. I compare it with the midwives. Back when I was doing my training in the early 1980s, midwives were just starting to come on the scene. And it's like, no, you have to have lots of training to catch this slippery projectile. And if you haven't gone to medical school, you cannot possibly catch this slippery projectile. And so the medical profession really rejected the midwives, but the patients wanted them. So the midwife program developed independent of the medical system in North America, Canada, and the US. And so we now have these two basically separate systems trying to help a woman deliver her baby. I met a young woman from Norway, and I don't know what the system is in the UK for midwives, but in Norway, to be a midwife, you have to have a nursing degree. your Bachelor of Nursing. You then have to have 2 years, I believe it was. It's been a little while, but I think it's 2 years of practical experience working as a nurse before you go back to midwife school, and however long that is. But when you actually finish as a midwife, you come out as a fully integrated member of the healthcare team. And I think that gives much, much better healthcare to the patients. And so now in Canada, we have people have access to cannabis. We have physicians that, for the large part, don't know anything about it, and a lot of them have no apparent interest in knowing about it. And it's like, okay, so you're just going to let your patients use this without having any idea of what they're doing or what they're using. And it seems kind of bizarre to me that that they would not want to be more involved in this whole aspect of their patients' healthcare. And so it's like we either integrate medical cannabis and make it a new specialty, which is what I think it is really, or they can reject it and say no, 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 and let the whole thing develop on its own, and leave the medical profession essentially out of it. And I don't think that's necessarily the best answer or the best approach.
Sure, I think I'd agree with you there. I think there's very little chance we're going to be progressing in the UK without the medical professionals involved. I'm also interested, if anyone's watching this who does know what is required to become a midwife in the UK, please answer that question in the comments, because I'm always interested to learn more things about that. It's fascinating what you say about Norway compared to Canada, and I'm interested in where we sit in that. But yeah, no, so thank you so much for coming on the show, Barbara. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've dipped into a load of topics that I wasn't necessarily planning to, but it's fascinating to hear about your perspectives in all these different areas, and the great work that you're doing over there in Ontario. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope that everyone at home really enjoyed the episode and enjoyed everything that we got to discuss here with Barbara today. Please tune in for next week on Grow Conversations, your window into the world of cannabis all across the world. And take care, and we'll see you very soon.